Hello there. My name is Matt Demore and I'm a former SynCom student. This is a video adaptation of a lecture I put together for the e-journalism course titled Exploring the World of Podcasting. In this presentation, we'll take a quick look at the history of podcasts, as well as the form, varieties, and delivery methods of this relatively young electronic medium. Let's start with the basics. Exactly what is a podcast? Well, Wikipedia defines a podcast as a series of digital media files, either audio or video, that are released episodically and often downloaded through web syndication. Before we continue, I'd like to point out that this presentation deals primarily with audio podcasts, although the video variety will briefly be mentioned. Next, I'd like to discuss the etymology or origin of the term podcast. The word was first coined in a 2004 Guardian article on the popularization of online radio. In this article, writer Ben Hammersley made a few branding suggestions and offhandedly offered us the word podcasting. Let's all be thankful that audio blogging and guerrilla media never caught on. As I'm sure many of you have guessed, the word podcast derives from iPod, Apple's popular MP3 player brand, and broadcast. Now let's turn our attention to the history of podcasting. Follow me, if you will, to the late 1990s, when most people's computer desks looked something like this. We start here because this was a crucial point in the internet's history. Around this time, computers were starting to be a common sight in most homes, and people were really beginning to explore the possibilities afforded by the World Wide Web. During this time, we saw the transition from AOL keywords to sophisticated search engines like Yahoo. But perhaps most importantly, this time marked the genesis of modern blogging. The internet allowed people to make the transition from media consumers to media producers. In effect, anybody who had a computer and an internet connection could publish their thoughts online, and at the turn of the century, the web experienced a huge boom in personal websites and journals. At first, these were known as weblogs, now known simply as blogs. But with this explosion of content came a new problem. It became difficult for the average user to stay connected with one person's blog in the vast and varied ecosystem of the internet. The solution to this problem took the form of RSS, which stands for Rich Site Summary, or Really Simple Syndication. The basic principle behind RSS is to keep internet users automatically updated. After subscribing to a website's RSS feed, an RSS reader automatically detects new content that's published on a website and conveniently stores it all in one place. With RSS, there's no more need to type in each individual site domain to search for interesting content. It's all delivered directly to you. In the wake of the RSS revolution, internet connection speeds continued to improve dramatically, and bloggers began to provide more dynamic content to their audience. This took the form of audio blogs. Early on, the MP3 audio format became the standard for audio blogging because it delivered a reasonable quality while maintaining a small file size. Keep in mind that 10 years ago, streaming high-definition video over the internet was still pretty much a fantasy. Publishers needed to keep their audio files small so that the average user could download it without sacrificing a day's worth of telephone use. As you would expect, the next step in podcasting technology was the modification of RSS to detect audio files as well as text. As with written content, RSS readers could now automatically find and download MP3 files that were published on a website or blog. Perhaps the biggest leap in the popularization of podcasting came in June 2005, when Apple added a podcast directory to their iTunes media player. Following the same principle as the RSS reader, this directory would allow users to subscribe to however many podcasts they'd like, and have new episodes downloaded automatically the instant they became available, absolutely free. So just to recap quickly, this journey started with the development of RSS, continued with the adoption of audio blogging, and finally hit critical mass with the iTunes podcast directory. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the iTunes podcast directory, here's a quick tutorial. Once you have iTunes open, make your way to the iTunes Store. Once there, you can click on the podcast link to browse the most popular podcasts on iTunes. Alternatively, if you're looking for something specific, you can use the search field. Once you've found a podcast that looks interesting, you can click on the Subscribe Free button. The podcast will be added to your personal directory, and the most recent episode will be downloaded automatically. You can manage all of your podcasts and download new episodes from your podcast directory. Like with your music, podcasts will be automatically synchronized to your iPod when you plug it into your computer. So let's recap the basic process for listening to podcasts. search and subscribe to a podcast, download the episodes you want, synchronize your iPod with iTunes, and listen to your heart's content. Next, let's look at the different types of podcasts that exist. Very generally, there are two main categories of podcasts. The first is what I call the reproduced content podcast. This is an audio or video podcast version of material from another broadcast medium like television. For example, many television networks publish free podcast versions of their nightly news broadcasts. The second category I call the original content podcast. These are podcasts that contain original content that hasn't already been broadcast on television or radio. In short, this is stuff you'll probably only hear in podcast form. Now I'd like to take a closer look at original content podcasts, specifically the two categories they tend to fall in. The first is the conversational show, in which web bloggers and writers have roundtable discussions relating to their preferred topics. For example, a movie website might have a podcast in which editors and writers get together and record their thoughts on the latest films and industry developments. These podcasts can contain several segments, and they usually run for 30 minutes to 3 hours. Let's listen to a quick clip from the Giant Bombcast, a video game-centered podcast from the editors of GiantBomb.com.
Hey, we're back. All four of us, not just Jeff and his hoodlum friends.
I brought some dudes by.
It's the Giant Bombcast for real this time. It's been, Brad and Vinny and myself. We've taken a break. We haven't been on this for a week.
I forgot how to talk.
You forgot how to talk. Yeah. We'll relearn you, Brad. What is it? It's Tuesday, December the 2nd, 2008.
Yep.
Games are out. The year is effectively over.
Pretty much. This week is the last week of anything like Prince of Persia.
As you can tell from that clip, these types of podcasts can be very informal, and they sound very much like talk radio programs. The other category of original content podcast is the feature. I call it feature podcasting because its structure and delivery is similar to that of feature articles in print publications. Much like feature articles, feature podcasts can be more artfully edited and make use of narration and exposition. Here's the introduction to a feature podcast titled Irrational Behavior, which profiles a video game development company.
You've met Andrew Ryan and visited the underwater world of Rapture. You might have encountered the malevolent AI Shodan and a collective species of alien that calls itself the Many. However, chances are you haven't heard the stories of the individuals who bring both these characters and the worlds that they inhabit into being. In this podcast, we tell these tales in our own words. Really, it's not about who here does what, but how who we are informs our contributions to irrational studio culture, as well as the games we make. I'm Sean Elliott, and this is Irrational Behavior.
Obviously, this introduction is much more structured and scripted than that of the Bombcast, which highlights the difference between conversational and feature podcasts. I'd now like to talk briefly about the social media dimension of podcasting. An important thing to remember is that podcasts are an internet-based medium, which means that communication between podcasters and their audience is practically built in. While some television programs may interact with the audience in a limited way, such as devoting short segments to letters and emails, podcast segments and even whole episodes can be shaped by audience feedback and discussions on internet forums. Another important thing to consider is that podcasts are a much smaller undertaking than, say, a television show. They're relatively cheap to produce and can reach a wide audience without the vast sums of money required to produce a popular TV program. And because communication between producers and consumers of podcasts can be achieved quite easily on the internet, listeners can follow their favorite podcasters over several years and various podcasts through the use of social media sites. I'd like to highlight one example that really drives this point home. In 2005, the video game site OneUp.com started a podcast called One Up Yours. After several successful years, OneUp's parent company, Ziff Davis Media, was forced to fire several employees, including one of the One Up Yours cast members. Within a few days, this individual started Rebel FM, a podcast that was primarily established to keep in touch with the loyal OneUp listeners. Fans heard about the podcast through various blogs and social media sites and quickly began listening. Rebel FM continues to be a popular podcast to this day. Next, a collection of former One Up Yours members start Out of the Game, another popular podcast that One Up fans flocked to. Then, Robert Ashley, of One Up Yours and Out of the Game fame, starts his own indie podcast called Life Well Wasted. Following that, Sean Elliott starts working for Irrational Studios and starts the Irrational Behavior podcast. Finally, the original host of One Up Yours leaves Ziff Media and begins working for ShackNews.com. Within a few months, he starts the Weekend Confirmed podcast. The point of tracking this history was to show how, within only a few years, fans of OneUp.com went from following one podcast to this. These fans became familiar with the editorial voices of the original cast members and tracked them as they established new podcasts. This is part of what makes podcasting so exciting, the ability to stay connected with your favorite voices on the internet. To conclude, I'd like to discuss some of the issues that are facing the medium of podcasting. Let's listen to another short Bombcast clip to get the ball rolling.
Our Fridays.
Oh yes. Well, let's talk podcast stuff.
Talk
since we're
podcast.
here in the podcast room. What is happening to the podcast?
So go back in history with the podcast. The Bombcast was always kind of funny because we'd set it up and it was like, hey, it's 2 hours. That's
Well, it just kind of kept growing.
Yes.
It was like we were having so much fun doing it. It kept getting longer.
You guys were in your little basement by yourself.
Yep.
And
Sit down there and say funny things to each other.
And it used to be a Tuesday. It used to be a Tuesday thing where you guys would do it on Tuesday and then it would go up Tuesday.
Yeah.
And we noticed that was absolutely horrible because it meant nothing happened on Tuesday.
Yeah, destroyed Tuesdays because it was the entire Giant Bomb team.
Yeah.
So you think like, oh, it's like a 2-hour thing. But that's 2 hours of my time, of Jeff's time, of Brad's time, and of Vinny's time. So it's actually 8 hours.
8 man hours. That's what they call it.
8 man
Or
hours.
men.
And then, it takes me a certain amount of time to do some editing. It takes me a certain amount of time to, kind of prep for it. So it is not just, hey, 2 hours and that is it. It's if you think of the amount of time it actually takes all of us to sit down and record a
Probably more
podcast.
like 14 to 15 man hours.
Yeah, it's a significant amount of time. Not that we don't like doing it. I love doing the podcast. Always have.
I like spending a good man hour.
It is one of my favorite things. But it just sets you up. It takes some time. So the idea here is that it costs us a fair amount to produce a podcast, and a podcast. Believe me, we've tried.
And deliver a 2-hour podcast.
Yeah.
Let's not
Bandwidth,
forget the actual
yeah,
cost.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, there is actual money going out the door for downloads and stuff. And I mean, what do we get in return for that? I mean, we get a lot of love.
We get a lot of love from the community. We get a
It's-
great mind share in the industry, but it's a hard thing to quantify. It's a hard thing to monetize.
We've never been able to sell it.
Yeah, and
Ever.
we've tried damn hard, and
Podcast advertising, the reason it doesn't work for most people, and the reason why I don't think I've ever been on a podcast that was getting actual money for any advertising they were running, is because you can't really quantify the number of actual listens. The best we can do is downloads, right? And then even that's kind of sketchy because I know I download it twice.
We basically have to do it based on the amount of bits served.
And it's an MP3. It's a very portable file. It can someone could listen to it for 5 minutes or listen to the entire thing 3 times, and we would have no way of knowing.
So advertisers want reporting. They want to know that their ads got heard. So podcasts are kind of a bad format for that.
The Bombcast crew brings up 3 very interesting points in that clip. The first is that in a business such as running a website, time is money. So when writers and editors invest man hours in producing a podcast, that technically constitutes a cost to the business. The second point is that for more popular podcasts, the hosting and distribution of MP3 files adds another cost to the equation. And finally, it's very difficult for podcasts to make money. With television, radio, and internet advertising, it's possible to get a fairly accurate idea of how many people saw, heard, or clicked on an ad. With podcasts, however, this isn't so easy. As it stands now, podcasts are entirely free, and the only financial benefit that companies can point to is the creation of mindshare. In essence, this means that podcast listeners are exposed to a company's brand, and in turn that can lead to loyalty and continued internet traffic. However, mindshare isn't as easily quantifiable as dollars and cents, and larger media companies might begin to reevaluate the worth of podcasts. Does this mean that we'll start getting charged for podcasts or have to pay for some kind of subscription? It's entirely possible, and some websites have already toyed around with the idea. For the time being, though, podcasts are entirely free, and now is the perfect time to jump in. If you haven't already, I fully encourage you to visit the iTunes store and start subscribing to some podcasts. For beginners, I would suggest checking if any of your favorite websites have a podcast, and if they do, have a listen. This is a very exciting new medium, and there is a ton of interesting content to discover and enjoy. I hope you found this presentation to be interesting and insightful. Thank you very much for watching.